The Morrison government is now sensibly focusing on this mammoth task of economic recovery. It would be a bold politician, or should that word be stupid, who would start advocating further lockdowns as opposed to dealing with the problem where it is. In spite of these horrific and tragic stuff-ups in Victoria, Australia stands at 167 deaths, 77 in Victoria, 49 in New South Wales. But you won't hear any politicians say that total deaths represent 0.00067% of the population. Sorry, I don't call that a pandemic. But to economic recovery, Matthias Cormann is now saying that the legacy of this massive debt could take decades to pay back. He argues the debt is justified because it saved 700,000 lives. Now, I don't know where that figure comes from, but would those jobs have needed saving if we'd done what the Prime Minister had said on March 15? For 8 out of 10, it'll be mild, but we must look after the vulnerable. What's happened is those with it, those without it, those mild, those critical, those young, those old, we're all bundled up into lockdown, and now governments are struggling to convince us that they know the way out of a problem that their alarmism created. In the next breath, they tell us we need confidence and incentives to expand and invest. They've done their best to destroy confidence and investment. The superannuation story is a measure of the gravity of the predicament facing Australians. Almost 3 million Australians have so far withdrawn more than $30 billion from their super. The government knows the mess it's in. It's pretending to help us by saying, oh, you can continue to access your second superannuation 10,000 right through until December 31. This is government using us to avoid the fiscal cliff. And then there's talk about tax reform. Whack up the GST. You mean someone who's lost his job or his business will vote for an increase in the GST so that some other business can hire someone for a job that doesn't exist? This is dog's breakfast stuff. Tax reform? 73 millionaires paid no tax in 2017-18. So multimillionaires somehow can lower their taxable income below the tax-free threshold of $18,200. And what kind of tax relief do outfits like Facebook and Google deserve? Facebook made $598 million in Australian sales to June 30, 2019. They paid $11 million in tax. That represents about 2%. Google booked $4.3 billion in sales in Australia. Tax bill, $49 million. That's a tax rate of 0.0011%. How much further tax relief would we give to this lot? Like the bloke pushing the barrow, the government has everything in front of it, which brings us to Adam Crichton. Shall I say the common sense of Adam Crichton? Interestingly, Adam, people are writing to say that the underbelly of what's happening in society today is potentially more damaging than the economic crisis. You've got freedom of speech being destroyed, militants in the street, monuments and statues being knocked down, people are terrified to speak out, governments are frightening the tripe out of everyone, and now we're ripping the guts out of the economy. Is there an agenda here somewhere, Adam?
Well, good evening, Alan. Look, you make some excellent points there in your introduction. Look, I do worry that that there's such a large portion of elites in society now who actually benefit from these shutdowns. We never had this situation in pandemics in the past, and so you ask about an agenda. Well, I think for some people, the shutdown is not so much about health outcomes. It's about kind of moving the economy into a different direction, into a far more state-controlled direction.
I think you're completely right.
And I think, you know, the magnitude of the downturn right now that we're seeing, not just in Australia, but in Europe and the US, is going to have very, very serious social and profound political consequences. Of course, we've already seen the US erupt into civil unrest, you know, very serious civil unrest. And that's only going to get worse, you'd think, if there are rolling lockdowns through that country. And of course, Europe is just as bad. It's going to be ripe for far-right political leaders and for you know, Spain and for Italy to actually leave the EU. You know, that might be a good thing, but it's certainly going to cause a great deal of dislocation in the world.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, you look at those figures from the International Labour Organisation, they're horrific. Between March and June, the equivalent of around 480 million full-time jobs were lost, and that's despite government spending $15 trillion to keep the economy alive. Good God, you can't get much worse than that, can you?
It is just extraordinary. It is just extraordinary. And of course, the bulk of those jobs are going to be in poor developing countries. And And to the extent that jobs are lost in rich countries, of course, it's the low-income earners as well. I mean, I think one of the points I've been trying to make here is that, the well-off are going to do fairly well out of this downturn, at least in the short to medium term. It's the poor in all countries who are going to lose their jobs and lose their incomes, especially in Australia, when the support programs are inevitably turned off, as they will be.
Absolutely. But see, the government would tell you that this is all legitimate, because if they hadn't forked out all this money, there'd be a whole more people out of work or dead. Now, if we hadn't let the Ruby Princess in and planes and properly quarantined people, we wouldn't have to tip in $280 billion. But,
yes.
I mean, you and I have made this point. Supposing all of this did save 5,000 lives, and that's a stretch, that's what, $50 million of taxpayers' money for each life saved?
That's right.
What?
That's right. Look, just... first on your point, I think the sledgehammer response in this country has been completely over the top. I mean, if you look at other islands like Japan, where there's not been a mandatory lockdown, they've had very, very few deaths per capita. So the idea that a widespread shutdown is necessary is clearly false. And then, of course, to hold out New Zealand as some sort of a genius response is also ridiculous. I mean, it's one of the most isolated countries in the world. So, of course, it will have few deaths. And as for that $50 million figure you just said, look, the value of a statistical life that the government has said for many years is about $5 million. That's what it will spend to save people's life. Look, it's not edifying to talk about this, but the reality of life is governments around the world have to do that all the time. And if we're spending tens of millions now for lives in Victoria, that is complete madness in any sort of historical sense.
That's the cost, isn't it? $280 billion. But supposing...
That's just the government.
Yeah, that's the government.
Now, that's not for everyone else. Yeah.
Quite. I mean, if you take the decline in the GDP, which they say by 4%, that means $60 billion has been lost in income.
Look, that's right. I think economists in the future, more sensible economists, I think the economics profession actually has been doing quite a bad job actually in its analysis of this crisis. But in the future, when we have economists who are not personally invested in the lockdowns, they will go back over these statistics and they will say, and they will come up with figures of extraordinary, eye-watering figures of what was spent to save lives. And let's be frank, in many cases, these lives, it's a shortening of 1 or 2 years, which is obviously tragic. But we have to be realistic. We're all going to die of something at some point. So it's not worth having a one-in-a-century recession that potentially causes massive civil unrest for decades to do that.
Unbelievable. Well done. Look, on something else which I find very interesting that you've been talking about, WFH, work from home.
Well, this is a very fun phenomenon. And look, this is something I've been doing as a journalist. Lots of white-collar professionals have been doing, and indeed about 40% of the workforce on some reckoning can actually work from home or are working from home, and that's actually more people right now that are working in the office, actually. So it is a major structural change, and look, it raises a host of questions about whether the boss should be able to monitor what their staff is doing, and I think whether or not they should be paid more or less because they're at home. I mean, of course, it's more flexible if you're at home. You can take more leisure time. You might produce the same output, that's great, but you might not be working as hard. I mean, there's a whole, what does sick leave mean? What does annual leave mean when you're already at home? This is these are very profound questions. Whose insurance is it if you hurt yourself?
Adam, when I heard some of those comments that you made, I thought, well, what about sandstone universities? I mean, many university students in narrative subjects, I mean, not things like biology and drama or whatever, have better results, limited travel time, working at home, wear a tracksuit, not a suit, less cost.
That's right.
What's the future of the Sandstone University?
Right. Well, it's not just the Sandstone University. It's all of those huge office towers in the cities which are largely empty at the moment, and our super funds can't even value them because no one's going to pay rent. Well, at least businesses are not going to pay rent to use them. And so we're going to have all of this surplus capacity in society, in the cities and universities. And it's, of course, it's going to lead to a collapse in rents. That will be good for some people, bad for others, but it's certainly a very profound change.
But if an employer can't monitor the activity of the employee working at home, is the employer likely to offer a lower salary package?
Well, look, I think ultimately, yes, that's the case because there is more flexibility at home. And I think if workers don't have to commute anymore, they don't have to fork out for various incidentals, dry cleaning for suits and so forth, travel costs, suits, then obviously they don't need to be paid as much, at least in theory. So I think you'll find in the long run there'll be changes.
What about the young ones? I mean, youth unemployment 16.4% in June. Scott Morrison says if you have a go, you'll get a go. Will they?
Well, that's going to be a joke. I don't think he'll be saying that as much anymore because it'll just seem patently silly. Because the youth are going to be affected by far the worst. I mean, even the global financial crisis, which of course was extremely mild by comparison, even that cohort, which graduated in 2008, 9, 10, they've had zero real increase in income over the past decade. And there's some new Treasury analysis out this week that suggests their incomes were a lot lower.
Yes.
So I would say if you're 25, 26 now and you're graduating, you're in a very, very bad position because it's going to be extraordinarily hard to get a job.
Awful to say that, but it is true. Listen, before you go, I want to flag something with you because Australia is a member of this G20. Now, in 2009, I'm getting a stack of correspondence on this. It asked this outfit, the Financial Stability Board, to devise a new policy to ensure that future banking crises could be resolved without taxpayer bailouts. And this mob, the FSB, Financial Stability Board, devised bail-in so that unsecured and uninsured creditor claims could be, quote-unquote, converted to bank equity and shares. Now, forget about all of that. The reality is they've defined unsecured creditors as including depositors. And Australia endorsed this in 2011. Right. What is the risk here?
That is right.
What's the risk here?
That is right. Look, the government insures deposits up to $250,000 per person, I think, but certainly anything beyond that can indeed be bailed in. And look, just a broader comment on our banks. I mean, they are very leveraged institutions. They're only safe because we think they're safe. For every $100 of bank assets, there's $5 of shareholder funds, and all the rest is debt. So, that's a fragile institution in a recession. So we have to realise that's a reality. And to be quite honest, since the financial crisis, they didn't improve the situation that much.
No, but given that people watching you now are depositors, they've got money in the banks, bail-in means the bank can appropriate those funds to avoid having to be bailed out by government. When was this explained? Right. When was this explained to Australians by the government of Australia?
Well, look, it wasn't explained, and the financial system is extremely misunderstood by ordinary people. But look, if they have less than $250,000, then they shouldn't be too worried. Eventually, the government will make good their deposit if there is any problem with the bank. But if you've got more than that, then you might not have it if there's a bank failure.
And just a quick one before you go: how do you see things now in terms of? I'm sure no government's going to start talking lockdowns anymore. But how do you how do you see the government addressing this issue? Do you think they know what they're doing?
Look, no, I don't really think so, because I know from my reading of just a superficial reading of the science of all this, it's extremely divided. There's massive differences of opinion on the effectiveness of these measures, and this is amongst very smart people around the world. So the idea that there's one right answer, that it's a hard lockdown, I think is completely farcical.
Absolutely.
And I think that there should be a lot of disagreement within government.
Quite. Bit of public debate.
I don't think they do know what they're doing.
Bit of public debate would be healthy. I think people are wondering whether those who got us into this mess are the very people that should be trusted to get us out of it. Great to talk to you, Adam. Keep up the common sense, my friend. It's not common. How good is he?